All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our fantastic webinar, Interpreting for Sexual and Gender Diversity. We have the amazing Kelly Henriquez here. And what can I say other than that she's an amazing figure in our industry. She is the 2023 AALB Interpreter Educator of the Year. She is a double certified Spanish medical interpreter educator, producer of interpreter content, and overall a fantastic human. My name is Izzy Olson. I'm the educational specialist for Hello Interpreters. Today's webinar is brought to you by Hello Interpreters. And without further ado, I think we can start our webinar because I'm not the only one who can say that they are super anxious to see what Kelly has presented or what she has prepared for us today. So, Kelly, welcome to our platform.
Thank you so much, Izzy. I think you're an amazing person too. I want to make sure that folks can see my presentation, or am I going to switch to it? Is that what I need to do?
Let me, yes, there we go.
There it is. Awesome. All righty. So if you are looking at me on camera, just letting you know right now that you might kind of see me looking off to the side because the setup is a little bit different than what I normally have. So we have the PowerPoint up on the screen. Everyone sees it. Great. What I'm actually going to go ahead and do is I'm going to invite you to scan the QR code that you see here or follow the instructions. Hello, everyone. I'm taking a peek at the chat. Scan the QR code, take a look at the instructions on the slide here while I go ahead and introduce our topic today. So today I'm going to be presenting on an incredibly important topic, which is interpreting for gender and sexual diversity. So like I said, before we get started, I'd love for you to join our poll in Mentimeter. You should be able to answer all of the questions except for the last question, which you can answer at your own leisure. They seem like really random questions, but I promise they make sense in the context of the workshop. You got to trust me on this one, okay? The last question, like I said, is something that you can keep up on your phone or on whatever device you're joining on and add words throughout the workshop. In addition to that, within the Mentimeter, which is the QR code and the instructions on the slide, there is also the ability to access the Q&A. So the Q&A, it will appear as a button at the very, very bottom of the page that will say Open Q&A. And you can actually ask your questions there, okay? I would prefer that you do that because the chat sometimes gets a little tricky. And also, it helps me to see, okay, what questions do people want me to answer versus just everyone posting their questions. You can vote on people's questions, give them a thumbs up if you'd like to see them answered. And I just want to put it out there that I reserve the right to not answer questions that I might deem offensive or personal or in any other way, shape, or form that might not be appropriate for me to answer, because I do get a lot of those questions, unfortunately, during this type of workshop. Another thing I would really like you all to do is to take out a notebook or a sheet of paper and start taking notes on the terms that you're unfamiliar with. So if you're unable to jot down the definition during the workshop, don't worry. There's going to be a bunch of resources provided to you at the end of the workshop. Give me just 1 second. I'm actually going to readjust my screen to make things a little bit easier for me. Like I said, the technology is something that I'm working through today, so I appreciate your patience. So this QR code and the instructions will be available to you on the screen for a little while longer over the next couple of slides, okay? And actually, I think I started seeing some responses here. I'm looking at it on my phone. My phone is right here. I see here, wow, we have like a real variety of people joining in today. it looks like we have about 15% medical interpreters, 15% mental health, and you could select multiple categories, by the way. We have, all across the board. We have social services, we have conference interpreters, we have interpreters who interpret in the workplace, higher education. We do have some K through 12 education. And then I see here court and or legal interpreters. And then we have some folks have selected, about 6% of us have selected the other category. So that's really interesting. And that's actually very helpful for me as we start this. So this gender and sexual diversity thing. When I say gender and sexual diversity, I'm talking about who most people refer to as the LGBT community, okay? So here we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender. Now, pansexuality, let me get out my laser pointer. Pansexuality is often included under the bi plus umbrella. So this is an umbrella term, bisexual. Bisexual. It's a category, okay? That doesn't mean that someone who's pansexual is also bisexual. These are just identities within this category. Non-binary here is under transgender because it's oftentimes considered a category within the transgender umbrella, although there are non-binary people who don't consider themselves to be trans. I will say just one last time, never tell a person who is bi or bisexual or pansexual that those are the same thing. They probably have very strong opinions about that. And the thing is that the definitions for these terms vary. All right, so we're gonna, depending upon who you talk to, you might hear a different definition, maybe even of lesbian or gay than you're used to hearing. So just bear that in mind. Now, I can tell you what my definition of bisexual is. I'm actually bisexual. I'm attracted to people who are my gender and people who aren't my gender. So a very common misconception about bisexual people is that they're attracted to men and women. Yeah, I'm attracted to men and women, but I'm also attracted to other people. We'll talk about this a little bit later. So I want to use definitions that are going to be the most accurate for the most people. So just going to leave this meme up on the slide. The important thing, once again, is to realize that definitions of these terms vary based on the people that you talk to. Okay? Different groups will define their sexuality and gender differently. So any definitions that I do provide during this workshop are not absolute truths, but they're just a baseline for general understanding. So we talked about LGBT. Let's talk about this acronym. LGBTQIA. This is another one that you might see. So we first added queer or questioning and intersex, which we'll go over later. Asexual is another umbrella category, depending upon who you talk to. Someone who is asexual may say that they don't experience sexual attraction. Okay, so these are some other identities that are within this umbrella of asexual. I will also say that you might hear sometimes people who are asexual refer to themselves as aces. So someone who is gray sexual might also be called a gray ace, or might call themselves a gray ace, but not always. Now, we can expand this acronym even further with more subcategories. So here, depending on who you talk to, again, we could spend a whole 2 hours on this, so I'm not going to, but you'll be provided with resources after this presentation to research to your heart's desire. Now, we can go even further with the acronym. I hadn't seen this acronym until I started putting this workshop together. LGBTQIA+. Whoa. So the text gets pretty small here, so I'm going to zoom in. Zoom. I wanted to see how the ASL interpreter signed Zoom. Anyways, appreciate our ASL interpreters who are here today. So now here we have 2 Qs, one for queer, one for questioning. So a lot of people think this word queer is an insult. I actually often refer to myself as queer, so it depends, again, on who you talk to. And this also varies across cultures. We have questioning. We're going to talk about intersex later. Pansexual gets its own letter now. 2S is for two-spirit. Now, two-spirit, it's an umbrella of identities accompanying both gender and sexual diversity, as well as cultural roles and spiritual practices by many indigenous cultures. And then the last 2 A's are for androgynous and asexual. But the thing is I could still give you a list as long as my arm as far as who's excluded from this acronym. So that's why I like to refer to these workshops as interpreting for gender and sexual diversity, okay? Just so you know, this is the last chance to join that Mentimeter, okay? Even if I'm not currently showing a question on the screen, you can, well, I can't show them on my screen right now, but you can still go through and answer all the questions and then keep that last question up where it asks you what terms you learned during the workshop. You can keep that up until the end of the workshop and submit as many words as you want, okay? So you can scan the QR code or you can go to menti.com and enter the code, which is 745779991. I feel like I'm doing like a telethon right now, where you're on the TV and you're telling people to donate for like public broadcast television or something. So the code is 745779991. Okay. I did want to take a peek while we're here at the second question. So we looked at the first question. It looks like we still have a nice even mix of interpreters from a lot of different specialties. So the 2 biggest categories are medical interpreters at 18% and mental health at 16%. And then we have social services and higher education in like a close third, kind of tied for a close third. Anyways, I first heard this term, gender and sexual diversity, at a training by Modi. So it's MODII.org, Modi.org. And it's actually a Spanish language website, and they have a lot of great materials and workshops about inclusive language. Thank you so much for posting that in the chat. Yes, a lot of interesting stuff about inclusive language in Spanish on that website. So there's a bunch of different categories. Inclusive language isn't just gender inclusive language. It's a lot of other things. And they do have an English version of the website, but that English version doesn't have as much information as the Spanish version. So, but it's a very well translated website. So I got to give credit where credit's due. Gender and sexual diversity came from Modi. And the nice thing about this term is we're not leaving anyone out. Okay, we're covering different genders, different sexualities, and the wonderful spectrum of sex characteristics. So now let's really get this show on the road. I just wanted you to understand why I use the name for this workshop. So I'm going to show you some things on the screen now. This isn't in the Mentimeter. Speaking of which, I forgot to look at the second question on Mentimeter. Oh my goodness. Let me look at that second question first, because I want to see what languages we interpret. Okay, I was anticipating on seeing mostly Spanish and ASL. So I see the 3 biggest words on our word cloud of different languages are ASL, Spanish, and I see American Sign Language. We have Portuguese. Awesome. We have, okay, y'all. I said non-English languages, and some people put English. Okay. I see Mexican Sign Language. That's awesome. I see Colombian Sign Language. That is so cool. We have Haitian Creole, French, Japanese, Farsi, and then I see Latin here. Okay, it's probably translation, I imagine. Awesome. Okay. That gives me a good idea of what kind of our language makeup is, because I will be talking about some languages in particular during this workshop today. So again, going back to the slide, I'm asking here, I'll be showing you 4 things here in a second. And I'll be asking you to think silently to yourself whether you agree or disagree with the following statements. And so I'm going to start each one of these statements off with, when I am interpreting, I should. So statement number 1, when I am interpreting, I should remain impartial and not let my own beliefs affect the message. Agree or disagree? Think to yourself. Oh, I'm seeing some additional languages in the chat here. Awesome. And some familiar names. When I'm interpreting, I should be respectful of individuals, their communities, and their culture. Okay? So I would say to keep your agrees or disagrees to yourself. Oh my goodness. Oh my gosh, I know our ASL interpreter. Hi. Okay. Sorry. I don't mean to make someone break their professionalism. Okay. Whew. So one that I should have up on the screen is when I'm interpreting, I should not say hi to the people that I know. Okay. Anyways. So statement number 3. When I'm interpreting, I should be familiar with a wide range of vocabulary and stay up to date on changes in my working languages. When I'm interpreting, I should be accurate and complete in my renditions. All right. So now I would love to see a number if we want to answer in the chat. I'm assuming y'all are on YouTube answering in the chat. Of these 4 statements, how many do you agree with? Do you agree with 0? Do you agree with 1? Do you agree with 2? Do you agree with 3? Or do you agree with 4? And I'm not seeing any numbers. Okay. See a number. I see 4. I see 4. I see 3 4s. Okay. So I'm going to tell you something real quick. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of 4s. I'm going to tell you something real quick. These all come from interpreting codes of ethics. Okay? So when I'm interpreting, I should remain impartial and not let my own beliefs affect the message. Come on, PowerPoint. This is the ethical principle of impartiality. So if you are a sign language interpreter and you are following the RID, Code of Professional Conduct, this is not its own ethical principle, but it is part of, I believe, the tenet about professionalism, if I'm not mistaken. So whether you believe in or support gender and sexual diversity really isn't relevant when you're interpreting. You're supposed to interpret things, even if you don't agree with them. When I'm interpreting, I should be respectful of individuals, their communities, and their culture. So this has to do with respect. This has to do with culture, which is present across, oh my goodness, medical interpreting codes of ethics, educational interpreting codes of ethics, even the court interpreting code of ethics, and the RID CPCs as well, both of these things. So LGBTQIA people aren't an exception to respect. Culture is about more than what country someone is from. A lot of people think, okay, I'm going to list off countries in Latin America here because that's my wheelhouse as a Spanish interpreter. So a lot of people think of, Mexican culture, Colombian culture. I don't know why I jumped down to South America there. Guatemalan culture, El Salvadorian culture. Okay. Culture isn't just that. And so we know, especially as Spanish interpreters, even within Mexico, there's so many different cultures represented. But culture isn't just based on where you're from, it's based on other things too. Deaf culture is a thing, right? Queer culture is a thing. And in addition to that, many cultures, including many indigenous cultures, embrace gender and sexual diversity. So we need to be mindful of this when we're interpreting. Number 3, I should be familiar with a wide range of vocabulary and stay up to date on changes in my working languages. All right, so this has to do with professionalism. So if you are a medical interpreter, you likely think of this as a separate ethical principle from professionalism, which is professional development. But the thing is that people talk about gender and sexuality, and you're going to have to interpret these things. So you need to be prepared. And the last one is, when I am interpreting, I should be accurate and complete in my renditions. Okay, yeah, that has to do with accuracy and completeness. So accuracy and completeness is actually from the CHIA or CHIA standards, which is medical interpreting. So if someone talks about gender or sexuality, you should interpret it accurately and completely. Okay? So we're going to talk about all of these things. And I'm not here today to convince you that what I'm about to explain to you is correct or the only way of looking at things. I'm here to make sure you understand different perspectives, which might, be different from yours, and that's it. You will interpret for someone, whether it be a person with limited English proficiency, a person who is deaf or hard of hearing, an English speaker who is lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, etc. I'm not going to do that to our ASL interpreter and list off all the things that I had on that slide. Any one or more of the umbrella of the identities that fall under this umbrella. So now that we have those common terms and some common ground established here, we're going to go ahead and once again get started. So we're really going to get started here from the beginning. When we're born, we are assigned a sex. This sex assignment at birth is primarily based on our external genitalia. So I am going to be using some terms related to genitalia here, which should be interesting being live streamed on YouTube. So, assigned female at birth. This is also known as AFAB or AFAB. So if someone is born with a vulva and we say it's a girl, okay, that's typically how it goes. Someone is assigned male at birth, which is also known as AMAB or AMAB. Someone is born with a penis and we say it's a boy. Okay, this is how it goes. Referring to people in this way, assigned female at birth, assigned male at birth, this is actually a more correct and a more respectful alternative to referring to someone as their biological sex, okay? Or saying, for instance, someone is biologically female. That's generally considered a no-no, and it's also not accurate. We're going to talk about that in a second. Now, these aren't the only two possibilities, though. Intersex people exist. Intersex people are born with sex characteristics. So these are genitals, gonads, hormones, and or chromosomes that don't fall neatly into male or female. Okay? So this is why, if you have been in the Mentimeter, I've been asking some questions. Let me pull up the answers to the next question. So I asked the question, have you ever had your sex chromosomes tested? And most of us, let me see here, about 70% of us said no. 6% said yes. 13% said, I don't know, and 13% said, prefer not to answer. So I wanted to make sure I put an option on there where you didn't have to answer, because I can understand that this question might make people feel uncomfortable. The next question that I asked was, it's really hard because the button on my screen is very, very small. Let's see. Come on now. There it is. Okay. So then I asked, have you had your sex hormones tested? So this includes progesterone, androgens. So testosterone is an example of an androgen, and estrogens. So estrogens are a group of hormones, not just a single hormone. And so I see here, let's see. About 70% of us said no. Some of us have said, about 2 of us said yes, they've had all of these things tested. And then someone says yes. 2 people said yes, some of these. 1 person said, I don't know. And no one said, prefer not to answer. Interesting. So it seems that, so I was actually kind of looking at the people who answered having their chromosomes tested. Now, this is anonymous. I can't see who individually answered, but I can compare your answers. And so I see the person who had their sex chromosomes tested also had their chromosomes tested. Okay. And then we have some people who didn't know whether they had their sex chromosomes tested also said that they've had some of their sex hormones. Excuse me. Pardon me. Someone earlier who said that they didn't know whether they had their hormones tested said that they have had some of their sex hormones tested. Sorry, it's way more complicated to explain verbally than sharing my screen. And unfortunately, I'm unable to share my screen with my poll on it right now. But the reason why I ask those questions is because a lot of people think, well, biological sex is simple. It's column A or column B. But in reality, it's not. Because sex is determined, it's actually, your sex is made up of your genitals, your gonads, so your ovaries or your testes, your hormones, and your chromosomes. So the thing is that when we're assigned a sex at birth, it's only based on our genitals, which is just one part of the equation. It's estimated that about 2% of people in the world are intersex. However, I will say that I kind of doubt those numbers a little bit, because how did they find that out? I would think that the only way to really do that would be to have a large enough sample size where you tested people's genitals, gonads, hormones, chromosomes. Intersex people can still be fertile and can still get pregnant. So I don't think we really have an accurate number of how many intersex people exist. Okay? So even if you're like, oh, I know I'm a woman because I've had babies, you could still be intersex and not know it. That is a thing. Okay? So sex is different from gender, though. Okay? So sex assigned at birth is usually based on external anatomy. Gender is a social construct. There have been some that have argued that sex is also a social construct, but we won't have that conversation. But gender is composed of norms, behaviors, and roles that vary between societies over time. So what usually happens is when sex is assigned at birth, gender immediately gets assigned too. So if a baby is born with a penis, we say, oh, that baby's a male. Oh, that baby is a boy. Just like if a baby is born with a vulva, we say that baby is a female, and then we automatically assume that that baby is a girl. So it happens pretty quickly, but this is probably part of why sex and gender get confused a lot. So these are common terms used to refer to sex and gender. So sex is usually male, female, or intersex, whereas types of gender are boy, girl, man, woman, non-binary, gender non-conforming, two-spirit, muxe, which I will spell, M-U-X-E, hijra, which is Hijra, and so many more. Okay, so Muxe is actually a gender identity from Mexico, from Zapotec culture, and Hijra is actually a gender identity from the Indian subcontinent. So many different genders. Now, we have the little ripple here, so that's an indication that we're remembering something from before. So you remember the slide where I was describing assigned female at birth and assigned male at birth? It wasn't that long ago, and I kind of already mentioned this, but this is what happens when we're assigned a sex and a gender when we're born, okay? So there's a visual inspection of genitalia. Sex is assumed based on that genitalia because remember, sex isn't just about genitalia, okay? It's about gonads. It's about chromosomes. It's about hormones in addition to genitalia. And then based on that sex, gender is assumed, okay? Now, if someone is born intersex, one of two things usually happens. They're born with genitalia that might look stereotypically male or female, and then assigned a sex based on that. And then, of course, their matching gender is assigned. And I say matching with big air quotes here. And those people maybe never find out that they're intersex, or they find out later on in life. Or sometimes what happens is someone who's born intersex may be born with ambiguous genitalia. So genitalia that doesn't look stereotypically male or female. And in this case, historically, doctors have either made the choice themselves or allowed parents to make the choice as to what sex they'd like their baby to be. They perform surgery or multiple surgeries on that child to make them fit inside the box of male or female. It's an incredibly harmful medical practice that robs that child of informed consent, often results in psychological harm, and while becoming less and less common, still occurs to this day. So I just want to make it clear once again that gender and sex are separate concepts, but often conflated and confused. So moving away from intersex, which is related to sex, we're going to move on to some basic gender terms. Again, sex is based on biology, though a very narrow view of it in our society. Gender is based on roles, behaviors, norms, and is someone's identity, their gender identity. So as I explained before, when we're babies, we can't really speak up for ourselves, but at a certain point, we develop our sense of self. So this person was assigned male at birth, and the doctor said, it's a boy, okay? And then this person later on in life says, oh yeah, I'm a man, okay? This is what we call cisgender. It's not a dirty word or a bad word. Cis, C-I-S, just means on the same side. So this person's gender matches the sex they were assigned at birth. Now, would we say this person identifies as a man? No, we wouldn't. They're just a man. That's just who they are. So it's kind of silly to me that we do this with transgender people, that we say, oh, they identify as, because then it implies that they're not really that. It's just a choice. And I just want to make it clear right now that sometimes I get questions from people at the beginning of this workshop asking me, well, what does this have to do with interpretation? The thing is before we can even talk about the interpreting stuff, we have to talk about the background knowledge. You have to have that foundational knowledge before we can talk about how this stuff applies to interpretation. So we'll get there, and we're going to get there soon, I promise. So moving right along, if this person says, you know what, you may have assigned me male at birth and said I was a boy, but I'm not a man. This person would be transgender. Okay, so trans means across. Translation means taking something from one language across to another. So transgender is crossing over the line from the gender you were assigned at birth to another gender. But man and woman, male and female, like I said, when we were talking about assigning sex at birth, isn't as nice and neat and clear cut as we like to pretend it is now. Which brings us to the next term. So this person says they're not a man or a woman. Okay, so someone can be neither a man nor a woman, somewhere in between, or outside of them both completely. So this is non-binary. Okay. Non meaning not, bi meaning two, not the two genders that we try to limit people to. So I'm going to be frank, I'm not here to argue the existence of non-binary people. They exist. I'm not here to tell you that you have to agree with it. I'm just explaining how many people in this world see gender and have seen gender for thousands of years. So I want to just point out here that this definition of non-binary comes from Non-Binary Wiki. So this is a definition that comes straight from a group of non-binary people. Okay? And I think that's really, really important, that when we talk about identity terms, that we go to the groups that we're talking about. We don't just rely on third-party sources describing what those people are, what their identity is, okay? And we're going to talk, again, more about this later. So, some societies like ours tend to recognize just two genders, man and woman. This idea is called the gender binary, okay? So binary means having two parts. I just want to point out here that on this slide, I see this a lot when I'm interpreting in medical settings, is that we have these forms and they'll say gender. There's a couple of things wrong with this. One, male and female are not genders, they're sexes. And two, there's only two options. So if someone were intersex, first off, this wouldn't be gender, this would be sex. If someone were intersex, would they check both male and female or check neither? But if we're talking about gender and we have man and woman, and those are the only two options, what would a non-binary person check? A trans woman would check woman because trans women are women. So I see this a lot in medical settings when I'm interpreting that the forms don't correctly classify gender and sex. And this often means that their computer system doesn't correctly classify it either, which is why there unfortunately isn't a lot of data on these things when it comes to the healthcare sector. But anyways, not getting too distracted. Sometimes I get distracted by this topic. So I will say that societies and the consensuses they hold evolve over time, just like language. So I'm going to show you a map of the world here, and there's going to be a lot of pins in the map. There are many cultures that recognize genders outside of man and woman, including many indigenous cultures that existed before the arrival of colonizers. These are just a few of those cultures, many of which, but not all, like I said, are indigenous or native, in which genders outside of the binary, man and woman, are part of the fabric of their culture and customs. Many of these cultures have had these customs for thousands of years, and in many cases, these gender customs are also tied to spiritual and religious functions. So much as we strive to take into account cultural differences when we're rendering our interpretations, this isn't an exception to that. We should also take into account what might be entirely different conceptualizations or ways of thinking about things many of us take for granted or assume to be true. We also can't impose our own cultural values on what we're interpreting. Otherwise, we're just not being impartial. See, there it is. We're getting back to interpreting now. Now let's talk about language. Okay, I want to talk about pronouns because everyone wants to talk about pronouns. So 1 in 4 LGBTQ youth in the United States use pronouns or pronoun combinations that fall outside of the binary construction of gender. So an example of one of these pronouns would be they. Okay. The singular they has been used for over 600 years as a gender-neutral singular pronoun in English. So I still hear from interpreters, and as interpreters, We're supposed to be linguists, right? We should be relatively knowledgeable about language. I hear from a lot of interpreters and even translators that the singular they is something new. It's not. I also hear from interpreters and translators, I don't use pronouns. Everyone uses pronouns. I is a pronoun, okay? So we all use pronouns. Everyone has pronouns. Pronouns are not a new thing. Introducing yourself using your pronouns at the beginning of a conversation might be a newer thing, but pronouns have been around since the emergence of language, probably, okay? So I wanted to talk a little bit about usage in English of the singular they, because I do see some people struggling with this. So the singular they can be used in situations in which someone is talking about an unknown or a hypothetical person. So, oh no, someone left their bag behind. I hope they come back for it. Some of my favorite memes on the internet are of people saying they don't use the singular they in English, and then in the next sentence, they use the singular they. Okay, we all use the singular they, especially if we're native English speakers, okay? So if we don't know someone's pronouns, we may simply refer to them as them. I haven't met Jessie before, but I've heard lots of great things about them. So this is someone the speaker knows about, hasn't met, but potentially doesn't know their pronouns. So while Jessie is a gender-neutral name and they is a gender-neutral pronoun, not all people with gendered names will have quote-unquote matching gendered pronouns either. So no matter the name, it would be inaccurate for us to interpret this with a gendered pronoun in the target language. Pro tip: you cannot tell what someone's pronouns are by looking at them. My pronouns are she, they. You cannot look at someone and say, oh, that person looks like a woman, so that person's pronouns are she, her. No, you can't make that assumption, okay? So, lastly, there are people whose pronouns are they, them. So Alex has been with us for quite some time. So if they've been with them for quite some time, they know what their pronouns are, right? They're very good at what they do. Assigning Alex a gendered pronoun when interpreting this phrase would effectively change the message. So in the first two examples, there are a few ways we could restructure the originals. Ooh, my laser pointer is going weird. Okay. There are a few ways we could restructure the originals to make them more easily translatable into a gendered spoken language. For instance, with the first one, I hope the person comes back for it, or I haven't met them before, but I hear lots of great things about Jessie. So in Spanish, you could use the indirect object, le, which is gender neutral. In the first example, so le is spelled L-E. In the first example, saying, oh no, a person left their bag behind, even though the word person in gendered languages would be gendered, either masculine or feminine. For instance, in Spanish, it's gendered feminine, la persona, so L-A-P-E-R-S-O-N-A. Those are two different words, but even though it's gendered feminine, it's still assumed to be kind of gender neutral, okay? So there are some ways to work around this in gendered languages, and I will say that the UN's website is actually a really great resource for this, looking at ways to take gender out of language where it doesn't really need to be. From what I understand in ASL, it's actually super easy because from what I understand, pointing at the person is generally considered to be what you do. However, I would say that if you're ever voicing for someone and you are referring to a person, not to refer to the person as, oh, the woman in the green shirt said, maybe saying the person in the green shirt said, okay, if you're voicing this as an ASL interpreter. So just not imposing that gender on that person, not imposing those pronouns on that person either. But this third one, if they, them are their pronouns, you can't just not interpret it or assign them different pronouns, or even worse, raise your hand and say, excuse me, this is the interpreter speaking. I'm sorry, but your pronouns don't exist in my language. Spanish is a gendered language, so you have to choose one, he or she. Don't do that, please. Don't be that person. All right. Anyways, we're gonna move on. I want to talk about thinking about our previous example. It's super simple if you're interpreting into a spoken language that's already gender neutral. Okay. So if we look at Nahuatl, so Nahuatl, which is spelled Nahuatl, we have our pronouns are all gender neutral. I do not speak this language, so I am not going to butcher it by reading out the pronouns here. But the singular they exists. The gender neutral you plural exists. The gender neutral they plural exists. Pretty easy. But from what I understand, ASL's pronouns are gender neutral. However, another consideration comes when referring to a person who is neither male nor female, not by pronouns, but by other nouns like parent. So from what I understand, signing at the top half of the face means male parent, dad. Signing on the lower half of the face means female parent, mom. So to speak about parent in general, or in a gender neutral way, you'd kind of stick to the center of the face. So you can sign parents, plural, as mom and dad, how it has historically been signed. But you can also do dad and dad, mom and mom, or parent, non-binary, and mom or dad. Okay? So the supposed challenge here comes from gendered languages. Okay? I'm just going to show Spanish here because this is the language I interpret. So full disclosure, I will be saying some relatively short Spanish terms. Okay? And I will also spell them. So in Spanish, I is yo, Y-O. So this is not gendered. But you, informal, you, formal, these are not gendered either. So for you, informal, we have tu, which is T-U with an accent. Or you might even hear vos, V-O-S. And then there's also usted, which is the formal, U-S-T-E-D. And then we have gendered singular third person pronouns. So we have él, which is E with an accent, L. And then we have ella, which is she, which is E-L-L-A. So if you speak a language like French or even Haitian Creole, these languages follow very similar rules. And then we also have we. So we is also gendered. So with the O ending, it is masculine. With the A ending, it is feminine. But this is plural. So if we have a group of people, sometimes people will use the generic masculine. So they might say nosotros, N-O-S-O-T-R-O-S. However, not everyone uses the generic masculine. That's another thing to consider. So there has also been a movement in recent years, not even in recent years, but within the Spanish language in different countries, where even if there is, let's say, a group of predominantly women, and there's one male in the group, kind of traditional Spanish grammar has said, oh, well, you would refer to that group as nosotros. So that's N-O-S-O-T-R-O-S. But the thing is that some people would refer to that group as the feminine because it's mostly women. So there's still some variation even. There's still some ambiguity when it comes to the rules that people use to determine grammatical gender. We also have y'all, informal, you all, and then we have formal, you all. So this is where we would have these terms. And then we have the plural they, and we have a masculine, and we have a feminine. So this is where it can get tricky. From my understanding, Russian is also a very difficult language because in Russian, the verb conjugations are based on grammatical gender. So I hear this from a lot of interpreters. My language is gendered, so I can't interpret gender-neutral pronouns. Okay? I want to take a step back from this for a moment before we address this point. I find this can be a very difficult instruction, a very difficult discussion for people to have when gender is involved. So we're going to remove gender from the equation for a moment. So this is where I'm going to go on my phone and pull up the Mentimeter and see if I can click the little teeny tiny button to get to the next slide. Here we go. Let's do this. Maybe if I didn't have such fat fingers, no. All right. So I asked, if you had to learn how to interpret construction terms, where would you look? I see a lot. Oh my gosh, there's a lot here. So I see dictionaries. Okay. I see literature. I see libraries. I see instruction manuals. I see Wikipedia, Lingue, which is L-I-N-G-U-E-E. I see YouTube. I see labor union. Okay, maybe I gave it away by getting a little excited about that. I see construction company, construction sites. Okay, so I do see a few folks here answered with dictionary. Okay, I would ask, do people only use words that are in the dictionary? It can be tough with these types of terms. I interpret for a lot of workers' compensation, and a lot of the people I interpret for talk about their jobs in construction. They talk about their titles, their equipment, their materials, you name it. It's almost like they kind of have their own language. So going back to gender here, and we'll come back to this example as well. We're going to kind of compare and contrast. People use non-binary pronouns in your language. I guarantee it. So how can I find out what they are? It's a good idea to consult sources by the people who commonly use the term in question. Okay? Just like we were talking about going to the construction company, going to the labor union, talking to construction workers, okay? Going to construction sites. That's great because you know what? Those words that you might find in the dictionary, like any Spanish speaker knows, okay, what's the word that's in the dictionary for roofer, R-O-O-F-E-R, versus the word that a lot of people actually use, right? Those are two different words. And we're not going to find that a lot of times in a dictionary. I will say within a 5-minute Google search, I do not speak Russian, okay? I cannot read or write Cyrillic. But I was able to find solutions by non-binary Russian speakers who use gender-neutral pronouns and verb conjugations in Russian. Took me 5 minutes, a 5-minute Google search to find people, okay? So a lot of people like to approach me and act like this information isn't out there. It's out there. And I've even heard from people, well, there aren't any non-binary people who speak my language. There are. There are. Okay? Now, by no means am I saying not to consult official sources. You can consult official sources, but that's only one small part of the puzzle. Now, why not look to other more official sources? I'll give you an example given to me by a dear friend who's an ASL interpreter. Some well-meaning folks use the sign that they learned for gay, whether it be from their professor in college, another experienced interpreter, or even a deaf person who isn't gay themselves. But without even realizing it, a lot of those people, that sign that they were using, it turned out it was a slur, an insult. The best people to learn terminology from are the experts. And in the case of identity, the experts are the people who are that identity. Okay? It's kind of like asking a random person on the street what they would call a person who converts spoken messages from one language into another. They're probably not going to use, the same term that we use. So you see here, this is from Collins Dictionary. And it says, a translator is a person whose job is translating, writing, or speech from one language to another. And then it has here synonyms, interpreter. So yes, colloquially, a lot of people refer to interpreters as translators. But we, the interpreters and translators of the world, know that don't call me a translator if I'm an interpreter. That's different, okay? But going back to gender, some of you may be saying gender neutral language and gender neutral pronouns aren't approved by the Spanish Language Academy, the French Language Academy, okay? So I'm going to say something controversial here. So what? If the person I'm interpreting for uses a particular term that's not in the dictionary, what am I going to do? Correct them? So this is where we start getting into some really important terms that I think a lot of people don't know. A lot of interpreters and translators don't know these terms. So if you're limiting yourself at all times to only what language academies or language authorities have to say about language, you're effectively subscribing to what's called linguistic prescriptivism. So linguistic prescriptivism is an approach to language that tells speakers how it should be used. It places values such as correct and incorrect on language and is often tied to classism, racism, colonialism, and more. Whereas linguistic descriptivism is a non-judgmental approach to language that attempts to describe it as it exists in real use. So I'm going to give you some examples of these. Now, for linguistic prescriptivism, I have a lot of examples from childhood. I remember a lot of them from elementary school. So I used to, and some of you probably relate to this, I would ask, can I go to the bathroom? And then the teacher would correct me, may I go to the bathroom? Okay. Or sometimes the teachers would say, ain't isn't a real word. And then we would respond, well, if ain't a word, then I ain't gonna use it. So unfortunately, I've seen lots of examples of interpreters subscribing to linguistic prescriptivism. I've witnessed and heard about interpreters who correct the people they interpret for or refuse to interpret terms because they're, quote, incorrect. So some examples of linguistic descriptivism. Urban Dictionary. Urban Dictionary is a great example. It describes a lot of terms that people use for everyday things. A lot of them are very offensive, and a lot of them are expletives, right? But it's a really good way to learn more slang, or even watching videos on TikTok too, especially if you want to learn the slang that a lot of teenagers are using. A lot of teenagers really like TikTok. It's a great place to learn more slang. So an example of linguistic descriptivism involving interpreters would be interpreters who don't judge people's grammar and just interpret it. Someone uses incorrect grammar and you're just interpreting their grammar mistakes. That's a descriptivist approach. Interpreters who engage in comprehensive professional development. So by comprehensive, I mean professional development that includes slang, regionalisms, colloquial terms, and a variety of sources that you might not call prestigious. And the cool thing about linguistic descriptivism is that it falls nice and neatly in line with the interpreter's ethical obligation to keep our fingers on the pulse of the evolution of language. Modern day linguistics is descriptive. So if you want to consider yourself a professional interpreter, I highly suggest getting on board with the field of linguistics, right? Now, take a sip of water real quick. As if you can't see me. I know I've been painting prescriptivism with kind of a negative brush, all right? But rarely are things in life black and white. There's always some kind of gray area, right? It's kind of like saying prescriptivism is evil and descriptivism is good, okay? I don't want to give that impression, because there are some instances in which prescriptivism does have a place. So when you're first learning a language, you have to learn some rules first. Now, I will say, to a degree, we also need to question why certain versions of a language are taught over others by default. For instance, when I went to high school and college and I was taking Spanish classes, why was it that all of the textbooks were in Spanish from Spain? Okay, these are good questions to ask. Why is it that a lot of the Spanish spoken in Latin America is not reflected in the Spanish Language Academy in Spain? Now, another situation in which prescriptivism may be appropriate are situations in which there's a significant risk for misunderstanding. So for instance, if someone is translating a service manual for critical equipment, okay, if something were to go wrong with that, if someone were to misinterpret that, it could have serious consequences. And then the last example, which I am so behind, is encouraging people not to use stigmatizing language. So some language can perpetuate stigma. We're going to talk about stigma. But stigma is a set of negative attitudes or beliefs, oftentimes about a group of people. So there is some language that is used by people that is negative towards another group of people and can perpetuate harm against that particular group. So sometimes marginalized groups will ask to be spoken about in a certain way. For instance, the autistic community, by and large, prefers to be called the autistic community and not the community with autism, okay? For many people who are autistic, their autism is central to their identity. So calling them a person with autism kind of almost makes it like their autism is something that they need to downplay or be ashamed of. And not all people agree with this, but I will say that the general consensus among autism organizations that are led by autistic people, which is very important, do kind of reach this consensus. So saying, don't call me an autistic person, saying, don't call me a person with autism, call me autistic, that would be an example of linguistic prescriptivism with a PRE. So it's a way for groups that have historically been marginalized by language to take back some of that power. So, perfect segue. Language is power. Will you use that power for good or not? So I did want to use this opportunity to just remind everyone that we do have the Q&A open in Mentimeter. And I see we do have a couple of questions. Let me see if I can address one of these questions. Let me see here. Okay. I have here a question, and I just want to preface ahead of this question that it may contain some terminology that people might find shocking, but I think it's an important question to read. With regards to the baseline asexual experience, while there isn't sexual attraction to others, may there be sexual pleasure from masturbation? I don't see why not. It depends, I think, on the individual person. There are a lot of misconceptions about asexual people, but as someone who's not asexual myself, I don't feel comfortable making any kind of statements that might be taken inappropriately. Actually, let me mark that question as answered. So I highly encourage you to check out the rest of the links, the resources that will be provided to you at the end of this workshop, because there's going to be a lot of information in there. And I will say one of the links is to my LGBTQIA resources page on my website. And I have all of my resources listed in reverse LGBTQIA order. So you actually see asexual first. And I do that on purpose because I feel like it's usually the identities that come towards the end of the acronyms that a lot of people know less about. And then I see here, my understanding of androgynous is that it's a gender expression or presentation, not necessarily a gender or sexual identity. Is this incorrect? Again, I would say that this really depends on that different people's definition of what androgynous is. That's kind of also how I've historically understood this term as well. But it is sometimes included in the acronym, which usually if it's included in the acronym, that means it's likely to be considered by some folks an identity. Yes, I am sharing my PowerPoint presentation. I'm currently sharing it on my screen at the end of the workshop. I think that's your question. Will I share the slides with everyone? Yes, there is that's actually how I'm going to give you all the resources at the end of the workshop. There'll be a QR code to scan, but you have to stay until the end. And that QR code will bring you to a page that will have the ability to download the slides as well as some other links. Okay. So yeah, I always try to share my slides, and my slides will have a lot of links in them. I don't think there were any links thus far, but you can see at the bottom of my slides where I use sources. Those sources are cited and you can search them. And especially at the end of the workshop, a lot of stuff is linked. All right. Well, I wanted to move on to our next section. Actually, I never really went over this slide, did I? I had a couple of things I wanted to say on this slide, so let me go ahead and do that. So I just want to make it clear here that I'm not telling anyone to change the message that you're interpreting. In fact, it's just the opposite. I am asking you to recognize that the things that we say or do can have an unintended additional impact. And as interpreters, most of what we do, our actions, are using language. So if someone's message is gendered, keep it gendered. But if someone's message is gender neutral, you need to, one, recognize it. A lot of interpreters don't know, can't recognize gender neutral languages, and that's a problem. And two, you need to interpret that gender neutral spirit where at all possible. If someone is making the effort, let's say if someone is trying to be respectful by being gender neutral with their language, and you don't interpret it, you could actually have a huge negative impact on the receiver of that message. It's not even just a matter of ethics. So at this point, I am going to be talking about the health and well-being of LGBTQ folks and some of the health disparities that they face. I want to highlight a couple of things here in just a second, and I want to respond to something in the chat. Someone's asking if I can share the link in the chat. Towards the end, I can. There's also going to be a URL on the slide that you can type in yourself. It's a bit.ly URL. So it's relatively short. And I'll try and paste it in the chat at the end. But returning to the slide, I am very intentional about the acronyms I will be using for this portion of the workshop. I know at the beginning I was explaining that I try to avoid using acronyms just because I do end up leaving out certain groups, giving visibility to some groups and not giving visibility to others when I use them. But in this section, I will be using acronyms because some studies, for instance, that I mention only include LGB, so lesbian, gay, bisexual participants, for example. So yeah, you're going to see acronyms during this part. And this is the really, really important thing, is that I'm going to be sharing potentially triggering information about suicide statistics on the next few slides. My suggestion to you, if you do find this information upsetting, is, well, one, I find this information upsetting. Putting together these slides, I think I cried like 3 times, but it's upsetting information. But nonetheless, it's important information because I think for a lot of people, it puts a lot of things into perspective about why I give these workshops and why knowing this stuff is so important. So if you do find this information upsetting, practice self-care in whatever way works best for you during the next few slides, and maybe devote some time after this presentation to some self-care. Again, even though I think it's a difficult subject to hear about, I think it's really important to try our best to listen to what I have to say because it's going to put a lot in perspective. So there is an increased suicide risk among LGBT youth. And this is due to minority stress-related experiences of stigma, discrimination, and victimization, as opposed to being LGBTQ in and of itself. So stigma are those negative beliefs, attitudes. Discrimination is a verb, okay? Victimization is being victimized, being a victim. Because in the past, some of the identities included in these acronyms were unfortunately misclassified as mental health disorders by certain organizations that I'm not going to name because there's multiple. But now that our understanding has increased, we know that that's not the case, that it doesn't mean that because you're LGBTQ that you're mentally ill. I just want to put that out there. That it's because of the stress that people face as a result of their identity, stigma, discrimination, victimization. And LGBTQ youth are more than 4 times as likely to report attempting suicide in the past year compared to their straight and cisgender peers. So this study is from the Trevor Project. I am actually doing a fundraiser for them this month. I'm walking 53 miles for the Trevor Project to raise some funds for them. Great organization. And this study came out in 2020. So when a study comes out, it doesn't mean that they interviewed and polled all these people in 2020 when the pandemic hit. They got the report and everything together and published it in 2020. So this is pre-pandemic. I wouldn't be surprised if it's worse now. This is where it starts to get really scary. 54% of trans and non-binary youth reported seriously considering suicide in the last year. 29% attempted. Again, this is not because they're trans or non-binary. This is because of the discrimination, victimization, and stigma that they face. 48% of intersex youth seriously considered suicide in the last year. 19% attempted. So when we start adding on additional marginalized identities, it starts to get worse. So I'm going to read this quote here on the slide. This is from the slide, one of the studies, one of the reports cited at the bottom of the slide. Research has begun to illuminate the impact of having multiple marginalized identities, such as being LGBTQ and a person of color, on mental health outcomes. So a marginalized identity means an identity that is kind of pushed to the margins of society. They often experience discrimination, lots of other things that get experienced. And oftentimes these aren't perpetrated by individual people. They're sometimes perpetrated by systems. A lot of times perpetrated by systems. Systemic racism is a thing, right? So when we take, it's like layers. When we take someone who's LGBTQ, okay, that's one of their identities, or maybe multiple. They could be trans and bisexual. That might be two identities. So we have two layers. And then on top of that, we add person of color, okay? Each one of those things can have an impact on mental health and amplify those mental health outcomes. So if we look at LGBTQ youth who seriously considered suicide in the past year, okay? So this was from that 2020 study. So again, that's when the study was published, not when they collected their data. So still a relatively recent survey. 39% of LGBTQ youth that were surveyed seriously considered suicide in the previous year. Now, when we start adding additional identities, someone who is Asian, American, and Pacific Islander, so we see this acronym AAPI, and LGBTQ, it jumps up 1 percentage point to 40%. When we look at folks who are LGBTQ and Middle Eastern and North African, another good acronym, it jumps up to 49%. When we look at folks who are deaf and LGBTQ, it jumps up again to 55%. Now, when we look at Latinx and LGBTQ, first off, I want to clarify that I actually don't use the term Latinx to refer to the folks that I interpret for, because most of them, by and large, refer to themselves as Hispanic. So you might hear me refer to this group as Hispanic, even though it's listed as Latinx. When someone is LGBTQ and Latinx, it says 30% more likely, okay? So I think that might mean 69%. It might. It tracks, given this next number I'm about to show you, okay? So if someone is Spanish speaking and LGBTQ, I would love to see if folks are still in the chat. What number do we think Spanish speaking is at? What number do we think? What do we think this number here is going to be? How high do we think it's going to be? Because we know each one of these has been higher than the last one. We're assuming that this one's 69%. It wasn't 100% clear. Whatever number you have in your mind right now, I want you to hold it and think about it. It's 84%. 84%. Okay. They didn't survey other languages. They don't have another report on other languages. They just had the report on, okay, deaf, LGBTQ, Spanish speaking. That's huge. Okay, that's huge. So by the time we interpret for someone who speaks another language or is deaf or hard of hearing and signs, or not, that person has a huge likelihood of, they already have such a burden of so much stigma on top of them. And we really need to be careful that when we're interpreting for them, that we're not adding to that burden, okay? So what can we do about this? All right, obviously it's not all on us, but we do have to realize that we have an impact, okay? So one thing that they found when it comes to affirming LGBTQ youth's gender by using pronouns that align with their gender identity has been shown to improve mental health outcomes. Yes, you can definitely have even more identities layered on top of that. You can be LGBTQ, you can be AAPI, you can even be a mix. You can be multiples of these, okay? And that only amplifies that impact, unfortunately. So one thing that people have found is that affirming LGBTQ youths by using pronouns that align with their gender identity has been shown to improve mental health outcomes. So transgender and non-binary youth who reported having their pronouns respected by all or most of the people in their lives attempted suicide at half the rate of those who did not have their pronouns respected. Reducing that rate by half, that's a lot. Transgender and non-binary intersex youth whose pronouns were respected by all of the people they live with had 64% lower odds of reporting a suicide attempt. 64% lower. Among transgender and non-binary youth, usage of chosen name resulted in a 29% decrease in suicidal ideation and a 56% decrease in suicidal behavior. For each additional context in which their chosen name was used. For each additional context. So that means school is one context, home is one context, the doctor's office, maybe with the interpreter, is another context, okay? The courtroom with their chosen name is another context, okay? Any setting that we interpret in and we might encounter them is yet another context. We can play a role in what we do simply by respecting people's pronouns when we're interpreting, okay? I'm not gonna mince words here. Using a person's correct pronouns in their language is suicide prevention. You can quote me on that. Please take your pictures. I'll point at it. Wait, there you go. I'm pointing at it. This, take your pictures now, okay? So that's it for the sensitive information, all right? But pronouns aren't all we need to be concerned about when it comes to the effect that we can have on the LGBTQIA+ folks we interpret for. I do find that this is where a lot of people get stuck. Something else I just kind of want to shift to right now is just kind of thinking about, okay, well, where is my role in terms of the well-being of the people that I interpret for? Do I have a role to support them or not? To what degree do I have a role in supporting them and potentially their mental health and potentially their physical health? We'll talk about that in a second. So we have these two concepts of beneficence and non-maleficence. Those are tough terms, I know. They're even hard to say. So beneficence is a core value in the NCIHC Code of Ethics. It means to support the health and well-being of the patient, their family, and their community. Okay. Now, not all of us interpret in medical settings, which is fine because I'm going to talk about those too. Beneficence includes non-maleficence, but non-maleficence does not include beneficence. I feel so bad. I feel like I'm just making everything so difficult for the interpreters. These are long, long words, y'all. Some people, I bet if you are sitting there right now, you might even be looking at these words and having a hard time pronouncing them because they're really that long. So these are still two very important terms because non-maleficence is not about supporting well-being. It's about doing no harm. Okay? So in the non-maleficence is actually one of the overarching values in the AAITE Code of Ethics, which is the Code of Ethics for interpreters and translators in education, which is relatively new. It came out in December of last year. Very awesome document, I might add. This is also, if we look at the RID CPCs, on page 2, see, look, I got my sources right here. Page 2, under function of guiding principles. It says the driving force behind the guiding principles is the notion that the interpreter will do no harm. So it's clear that if you're an educational interpreter, if you are a sign language interpreter, okay? But something else to consider is that if you're a sign language interpreter and you're interpreting in, let's say, medical settings, we also should be aware of what the ethical expectations are within those settings. That is important. So beneficence is all about supporting health and well-being. So it implies focusing on positive outcomes and implies a more active role. Whereas non-maleficence is all about doing no harm, focusing on preventing consequences, and implying a more passive role. Okay? Now, in the NAJIT Code of Ethics, so NAJIT, we don't really have this. It's not explicitly mentioned. So knowing the codes of ethics of the setting you're in is really important in determining, okay, well, if I'm interpreting for someone and one person is repeatedly misgendering the other person, what is my role here? Okay. If I am faced with interpreting gender-neutral pronouns, knowing how important those gender-neutral pronouns are for someone, now you know how important it is for you to interpret those pronouns correctly, okay? So, talking a little bit more about well-being, stigma-related stressors. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but I love this flow chart. Stigma-related stressors experienced by LGBTQ people can lead to disruptions in general psychological processes, like coping, emotional regulation, interpersonal functioning, and cognitive processes. So stigma-related stressors set off this chain reaction, and we've determined that stigma is a set of negative attitudes or beliefs, kind of like biases. So we have some external stigma here. We have discrimination and victimization. So external stigma comes from people outside of ourselves. Internal, though, is things like internalized homophobia and transphobia. There's also biphobia. I am bisexual. And a lot of times that I'm asked to, well, biphobia looks a lot like this. Well, Kelly, you're not really bisexual because you're married to a cishet man, a cisgender heterosexual man. My relationship doesn't define my sexuality. It doesn't affect who I'm attracted to. Doesn't change the fact that I'm still in a monogamous relationship, okay? But internalized biphobia looks like this, okay? So external biphobia looks like people telling me that I'm not queer enough to be a part of the community. Internalized biphobia is me telling myself I'm not queer enough to give workshops like these, which I've been invited to present at workshops like these before. And there have been times where I've said no because I'm like, you know what? I'm not queer enough. Okay. Expecting rejection. When people reject you all the time for who you are, you just begin to expect it. It's like learned helplessness. Identity concealment, hiding who you are. Well, if everyone's going to reject who I am anyways, why am I going to show them who I am? So these stigma-related stressors can lead to disruptions in psychological processes, like coping, emotional regulation, so how you are able to manage your emotions, interpersonal functioning, how you interact with other people, and also cognitive processes, how you think about things. And these things can contribute to higher prevalence of depression, anxiety, substance use, and trauma symptoms, which can affect LGBTQ folks' mental health and even their physical health. So what's that saying about assumptions? I have it right here. I'm going to say kind of a bad word. Yay. No. And this is an actual saying. So maybe if you already know about all this gender and sexual diversity stuff, maybe you're like, maybe this is the one thing you learned from the workshop. To assume makes an ass out of you and me. So an ass is another word for donkey. Just putting that out there. Anyways, what a lot of folks don't realize is that we don't have to have malicious intent or be homophobic or be outwardly transphobic to add to these stressors. Many times it's something as simple as assumptions we make that can actually do harm. So we're going to do a little test. I'm going to ask you to imagine something. I really want you to set the scene in your mind. Really imagine the surroundings, the people, the noises, maybe even the smells, okay? Close your eyes if it helps. You ready? Okay. I can't see anyone. I can only see the interpreters. So. My suggestion would be, once I ask the question at the end, prepare yourselves in the chat, okay, for the question I'm going to ask at the end. All right, so here's a little situation, our scenario. You're interpreting for a patient in a clinic. So if you're having a hard time imagining this, maybe imagine the doctor's office where you get medical care, and imagine that somehow you have an interpreting assignment there to interpret for someone. Could be virtual, potentially. Maybe they have you on the video cart and they're rolling you around. Well, the nurse ends up calling them from the waiting room. And maybe the nurse is bringing you out on the little video screen and rolling you up as the patient comes in, okay? And the nurse greets the patient greets the nurse, and the nurse leads the patient back to the nurse's station. The nurse takes the patient's vitals. So maybe puts the blood pressure cuff on, checks their blood pressure, takes their temperature. Hopefully they're not using one of those silly forehead thermometers. They do their pulse ox. And then the nurse finishes taking the patient's vitals, takes them to the exam room. And right as the nurse puts the patient in the exam room, the doctor comes up behind the nurse. So the doctor enters the room and the doctor greets the patient. The patient greets the doctor and shares their pronouns. And you're interpreting this whole interaction. So this is where I want you to be ready to answer my question. As soon as a thought pops in your head as an answer, just go with your gut reaction. Was the nurse you imagined a man or a woman? It came out of left field, right? Was the nurse you imagined a man or a woman? So while I'm waiting for some responses, hopefully in the YouTube chat, I am going to go to the next question in Mentimeter. Ooh, someone imagined the nurse as a male. Okay, so a man, I'm assuming. Okay, woman, man. Oh, interesting. You imagined the nurse as a man. Okay, so we have cultural differences here likely, and also too we have personal experiences as well. Maybe we know someone who's a man, right? Who's a nurse. That can sometimes change our perceptions. However, a lot of times, yeah, some people don't imagine the nurse like having a being a man or a woman, just as kind of like a faceless, nameless figure. I will say that a lot of times when I give this, a lot of people say woman. So I asked in Mentimeter, do you have biases? 64% of us said yes. 21% of us said no. And 14% of us said, I don't know. Okay. So hopefully maybe some of you who answered no can see here that you might have something called, wait for it, there's this thing called gender bias. And it doesn't matter if you're a man, a woman, or neither. All of us have usually some form of gender bias. All of us have biases. All of us. I have biases. I have biases about some of the stuff that I'm presenting about today. I try to uncover them whenever I can. Okay? So it doesn't make you a bad person to have biases. It's normal. Okay, so if you assumed the nurse was a woman, this is an example of gender bias. So the first step, though, to combating the effects of your biases and to maintain impartiality is to recognize them. So here are the two biases I see most often when it comes to interpreters. And they're very much related to this workshop, which is a big reason why I do these workshops and really put myself out there doing these, I might add. So, heteronormativity, the assumption that heterosexuality is the norm and privileges this over any other form of sexual orientation. Whereas cisnormativity is the assumption that cisgender is the norm and privileges this over any other form of gender identity. So, cisgender would be someone is assigned male at birth, they say it's a boy, and that person grows up and says, I'm a man. Okay, that would be cisgender. So I'll give you some examples of this. Okay, so if you subscribe to heteronormativity in a situation in which a woman is being asked about her spouse, if you interpret a gendered language, you might interpret this as male spouse. That's heteronormativity, assuming that that woman has a male spouse, okay? Cisnormativity would be assuming that that woman couldn't possibly be trans. A lot of people have this false assumption that, oh, I would know if someone's trans. You don't. Just like you can't look at someone and know whether they're non-binary, know whether they're heterosexual, right? You can't look at someone and know all the facets of their identity. So by our powers combined, woo! Sorry, I just really love this slide. This is the longest word in my workshop, cis heteronormativity. There we go. All right, so another example of a common bias is binary gender normativity. So this is the assumption that there are only two genders. Again, this is another one I observe a lot among interpreters. This form, This form needs to be fixed, but I have it here just as an example of how not to do demographic information when it comes to gender and sex. Ooh, don't have a transition for that one. Sorry. This is a new slide. You can tell because there's no transition. Okay. In English, I ask medical interpreting students of many different languages what they might do in a situation if a patient doesn't give them a chance to interpret. A lot of native speakers of non-gendered languages will say, well, if they don't give me a chance to interpret, okay? Whereas the native speakers of gendered languages often say, well, if he or she doesn't give me a chance to interpret. Okay, I only said a patient. I didn't specify the gender of the patient here. So by saying he or she, okay, in their answers, they are paraphrasing my question. But one of them is making an assumption and subscribing to binary gender normativity. When we're interpreting, we have to do our very, very best to be neutral, impartial, and accurate. Otherwise, we might end up changing the message. So this brings me to the last segment of the workshop. And then once I'm done with this part, I'm going to take a peek at the questions in Mentimeter again and see if we have any more questions. But otherwise, I'm going to go through my recommendations because we've talked a lot about, okay, that's the what, but now let's talk about the how. So what can I do to provide more ethical and affirming interpretation services to diverse communities? So these recommendations are adapted from this really awesome study that is specifically about how healthcare providers can better serve non-binary patients. They interviewed a bunch of non-binary folks and asked them for their input. So while these original recommendations were specifically geared towards better serving the non-binary community, they actually have a lot of really great lessons in them for those of us who serve not just populations that are diverse in terms of gender and sexuality, but diverse populations as a whole, which I think all of us do. Okay. So as we go through these categories, you should hopefully have been keeping a page, right, of words that you don't know, a notebook, a list, okay? I'd like you to either flip it over or flip to the next page. And I want you, when I go through these 4 categories, to identify at least 3 actionable things, 3 things you're going to do in the coming days and weeks to interpret more effectively for gender and sexual diversity, okay? I will say it's better to pick ones in the earlier categories than the later category. If you pick all of your things from category 4, you're not doing the work to be able to do things in category 4, okay? You need to do the work in the first 3 categories before you can get to the 4th one. So definitely, I would probably say only pick 1, maybe, from the 4th one, unless you've done all these other things before, okay? So step 1 is to do the self-work, okay? Look at yourself in the mirror and realize that we are all monkeys inside. No, I just thought this picture was really cute. Look at those little hands. Those little hands, they're so little. Okay. So first thing is to engage in self-reflection. And this actually has a link here to something that you can look at. And you can actually consider, okay, well, if I had to fill this out, how would I fill it out? It's a really great self-reflection activity. And I have to give credit where credit is due. My colleague from the Willow Tree Project uses this exercise in a lot of their workshops. But I really, really love it. And that's why I wanted to link it on this slide. The second thing is to check your biases and assumptions. So this link here is to it's a series of quizzes about implicit bias. These are actually, they're not just like those silly quizzes that you take on Facebook. They're actually like scientific. They were designed by Harvard, okay? I'm fairly certain. So practice looking at people as a blank slate. Maybe the reason why you're repeatedly misgendering someone is because you're randomly memorizing pronouns instead of changing the way you think about them. And this one here, oh, wait, I didn't put that one up on the slide. There we go. And then this last one here is to develop a sense of gratitude for the emotional labor marginalized people expend to educate others. It is exhausting for people to have to explain their existence and the struggles they face over and over again. If someone does this for you, recognize it as the precious gift it is. It's Pride, y'all. Okay? It is Pride Month. This should not be the month that we're going around and telling people that they have to get up on the podium and talk about all their super personal experiences, okay? But a lot of people do. So just be grateful for people who take the time to educate you, okay? Because these are not fun things to present about. I'll tell you, in the past when I've presented about this, I've gotten threats. I've gotten really, really inappropriate questions, things like that. I'm not trying to play the victim here. I'm just saying that it's tough to present on things. It's tough to present on the identities of yourself and people you love and have people telling you that you and your loved ones, you don't matter to me and you don't exist. And I don't think you should deserve the same things as everyone else, okay? So just recognize that as what it is, okay? Don't assume that, for instance, non-binary people especially are obligated to explain their gender identity to you. And this goes for trans people in general. There are so many resources available to learn about these things. You will be provided with many resources. Professional development, and this is a quote, cannot and should not inflict harm on others. Okay? Continue to educate yourself. Yes. So recognize that you don't know everything and there is always more left to learn. Research the terms you wrote down during this presentation. So I have this link here. This links to my LGBTQIA resources page on my website. It has a bunch of resources and they're listed by difficulty level. Okay? So if you feel like you don't know a lot about a topic, maybe starting off with the beginner difficulty things and working your way up. Seeing mistakes as learning opportunities, not as failures. A lot of times people get stuck in the fact that they made a mistake and they can't get over it. They don't move past it. They don't do anything with that. They just fester, okay? So move past your mistakes and see them as opportunities for growth. You'll be happier with yourself, I promise. This quote is directly from the study I mentioned. Listen to us, trust us, and commit to doing better. So show up to advocate, educate where you can, and listen to us. So advocate here, okay? I mean both in the context of medical interpreting if necessary, and only if necessary, and only if you understand what this role entails, right? But also in a more general context of speaking up on behalf of other people. It doesn't have to be when you're actively in your role as an interpreter. You can advocate on your free time too. Educate where you can for the love of all that is holy. Please do not educate people on something that you do not know anything about. Have the wisdom to know when you don't know about something. I've attended way too many workshops where people have zero clue what they're talking about when it comes to this topic, but they're still presenting on it. By no means am I saying that I am the best person in the world. I'm just one of the people who's stepped up. There's not really a whole lot of people in the spoken language interpreting community talking about these topics. So I'm kind of like, well, I guess I'll do it. Okay. So if you have the knowledge, okay, then definitely share it. And also listen to people because people know themselves better than you ever could. I don't get this. Why do people think that they know other people better than that person knows themselves? Another thing too is don't ask invasive personal questions. So I have this is a link to a website that talks about questions not to ask people in the LGBTQ community. I probably get at least one of these questions every couple of days. So, and I have gotten many of these questions. I should have like a bingo card of the questions I've gotten from this list at some of these times that I've done these workshops. So, a better thing to do if you feel the urge to ask one of these questions is to instead look inside of yourself and ask yourself, why is it so important for me to know? Insert embarrassing question here. Yes, clarify when necessary when you're interpreting, but be respectful when you're doing so. And then the very, very last category I have, it's kind of a mishmash of applicable recommendations from the study mentioned below, along with my own recommendations. So greeting the people we interpret for with non-gendered language is a great place to start. It doesn't even mean you have to use unconventional language. It can be as simple as not automatically referring to someone as sir or ma'am based on their appearance or the sound of their voice. Which I had a company that I was interpreting for that made me say sir or ma'am based on the sound of the person's voice, which even with people who are not members of the LGBTQIA community resulted in errors. Not all women have high-pitched voices, and not all men have deep voices, okay? The non-binary participants in the study actually pointed out that they felt at ease if they saw someone from their care team wearing a pride flag pin, okay, or a sticker or a button, okay? I will say don't wear these things if you're not actually willing to do the work and you haven't done any of the previous 3 steps, okay? Please don't do that. I've seen so many people wearing rainbow flags and they don't know what trans means. You can't be selective with this. You have to know, okay? You need to educate yourself. That's part of the work to earn the badge, okay? Another suggestion is maybe not wear the non-binary pride flag if you're not non-binary. Maybe don't wear the trans flag if you're not trans. There are varying opinions on this, but it might be confusing for some people. They might see you with a flag on you and think, oh, you must be trans because you're wearing a trans flag, which could be awkward, or that person might be a little upset. They might be like, I was tricked. I thought you were trans and I thought I was safe with you. But now I see you're wearing a trans flag and you're not trans. So that's just something else to consider. Always listen to the communities and their opinions on this and how they feel about this, which there are some excellent resources on my LGBTQIA resources page, which will be shared with you. Or you can wear something displaying your pronouns. You can even include your pronouns in your pre-session, or as I've been doing in my interjections. Okay, if I interject and say, excuse me, this is the interpreter speaking, they need to, okay? It's a really, really easy way to increase visibility and raise the bar. And then lastly, knowing the lingo is super important. I'm pretty sure this links to the same page, my LGBTQIA resources page again. It means, what this means is, try to limit your need for clarifications when you're interpreting, if you can clarify, by being prepared. In other words, we should always try to be proactive, not reactive, when it comes to professional development. Okay? So that is pretty much all I have for you. I will take a peek at the questions. This is the bit.ly link to the slides. So I'm going to go ahead and type that in the chat. Actually, I got to do the HTTP. Sorry. / So it's HI, capital HI, as in Hello Interpreters, GSD, as in Gender and Sexual Diversity, and then 2024, which is this year. So that link is going in the chat. Okay. You can also scan the QR code. And I would like to thank Hello Interpreters for, and I know it seems really rude for me to be looking down at my phone while I'm saying this, but I'm trying to multitask. I'm going to try and see if I have any additional questions in the Mentimeter. I'm going to take a peek at some of the words that people used. I don't see any questions, but I do see lots of words that we learned in this workshop. So I'm very, very excited that we all learned some additional things.
Thank you so much, Kelly. It's been so wonderful to hear you talk about the differences between sex and gender and how to be impartial, updates in the lingo. I mean, even for me, I identify as a lesbian, and I learned so much during this workshop. So really, really helpful. And it was extremely wonderful to hear you talk so honestly and openly about your experience as well, being bisexual and biphobia. I think another thing that is very or lesser known, I should say, is that sometimes even in the community we eat our own, as in people who are lesbians discriminating against bisexuals, pansexuals, or trans people. And that's not good. So it's good that we speak about it. It's good that you speak about it and are so brave. I really appreciate it. I know everybody here at Hello Interpreters has very much appreciated your presentation. And for all the attendees, thank you for keeping an open mind and also being open, having an open heart, open ears, and just taking the time out of your day on a weekday to hang out with us. And again, being so open-minded to these great topics. And you'll find in the chat different links to, I don't remember, I think it was Modi or something like that I typed earlier. Yes, perfect. And we did just put the HIGSD 2024, perfect. And you'll also find the post-webinar survey to get your certificate of attendance and your CEUs for all of our institutions that we certify with. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me via email, info@hellosinterpreters.com, or even just me directly, which is Izzy, IZZY, @hellointerpreters.com. I find that a lot of people find it easier to reach out directly to me rather than the info, so I'd like to offer it if needed. Other than that, just thank you again. I really appreciated it, Kelly, to hear your awesome words, and hope to see you again soon. This is the second time you've been involved in our webinar series, so it's been great.
Yeah, and Izzy, I just wanted to say thank you so much for the opportunity. I know I was kind of like looking at my phone and getting distracted as I was saying it, but I wanted to just once again say thank you so much to Hello Interpreters for the opportunity. And also for my understanding, you all made the CEUs for this free, which is super awesome and like way to go. Like, you know, like we all know, well, we hopefully do, that ally isn't just something that you call yourself. It's a verb. You have to take action. And so I think that's a really great gesture of allyship to offer these CEUs for free about this topic, because then it makes it more accessible for people and really gets this information out there. So great gesture for Pride. I love it. Makes me so happy, and I appreciate y'all so much.
Yes, I was super excited as well. But to be fair and to be honest, several of our team members are in the queer community, so I guess we had to, you know. It's our pleasure. Thank you again, Kelly, and thank you to all the attendees. Thank you to our amazing American Sign Language interpreters. We value your work. And with that said, I'm going to go ahead and close the webinar. You get 1 minute back of your time, everybody. And if any questions arise, you know how to contact me. You know how to see the resources on Kelly's page. So yes, I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Have a great afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Bye-bye.